live in 3, 2, 1. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name's McKaylee. I work at Tattered Cover Bookstore. And first and foremost, I want to say thank you. Thank you for joining us on this event tonight. Thank you for being a part of our virtual community. And thank you for supporting local independent bookstores. It means more to us than you'll ever know. It's something that we wouldn't be here without your support. The last year in this global crisis we're having, or the last 50 years, which is how long Tattered Cover's been around. It is our 50th anniversary in 2021, which is an amazing feat for a bookstore. So thank you for being a part of that. And thank you for continuing to shop locally. It means the world. So before I go any further, I want to let you know that closed captioning is enabled for those who might want it or need it. There's a black bar down at the bottom of the screen, and if you click 6cc on it, you'll be able to enable closed captioning should you want it or need it. And so for those of you joining us tonight that might not know about Tattered Cover Bookstore, Tattered Cover is a local independent bookstore that is located in Denver, Colorado, and we have 4 locations, soon to be 5, which is awesome. We have our exclusive children's location that is opening up at Stanley Marketplace in Aurora over the summer. And then we have one of our locations is mid-move right now, and we're actually going to be opening that up very soon, late May, early June. So keep an eye out for those. But the 3 stores that we currently have open right now, you can come in and shop as long as you're wearing your mask over your mouth and your nose. You can come and browse the shelves for about 90 minutes or so. Or if you're like me and want to shop in your pajamas, or you're not in the area, you can always go to tatteredcover.com for all of your bookish needs. Also on tatteredcover.com is our event schedule. Holy cow, we have so many upcoming events. It's crazy. This weekend alone, we have local chef Adrian Miller and his latest food criticism of, it's called Black Smoke, which is an amazing cookbook. Also this weekend, we have Jane Goodall for a ticketed event that you can come and buy tickets for as well. All of those are virtual, and you can get all of the tickets and information at tatteredcover.com/event. And now I want to talk about the event that we have tonight. It's very exciting. This is a new book that came out last week, Lincoln in Private by Ronald C. White, who is our author that we're featuring tonight. And just a little bit about Mr. White. Ronald C. White is the New York Times bestselling author of American Ulysses and 3 books on Abraham Lincoln, most recently, A. Lincoln. White earned his PhD at Princeton and has taught at UCLA, Colorado College, Whitworth University, and Princeton Theological Seminary. He has lectured at the White House, been interviewed on PBS NewsHour, and spoken about Lincoln in England, France, Germany, Italy, Mexico, and New Zealand. He is the reader of the Huntington Library. He is a reader at the Huntington Library, and is a senior fellow of the Trinity Forum in Washington, D.C. He lives with his wife, Cynthia, in Pasadena, California. And like I said before, we are talking about Lincoln in Private tonight, and it's my honor to welcome Ronald C. White. So we're going to change our view around here and unmute the author tonight. Perfect. Hi, Ron.
Hi, Michaela. Thank you, McKaylee.
Yes.
I was telling her before we started, my granddaughter is Michaela.
I know, it's okay. It happens all the time. And, you know, that's the name in your brain. It makes sense. But thank you so much for joining us virtually here. We're so excited to have you.
I'm excited to be here. I've lived in Colorado. I love Colorado. I've long admired your bookstore. I love independent bookstores. And to be invited to be at Tattered Cover is a great privilege and honor. So I'm delighted to be with everyone here this evening.
Well, thank you so much. And we're very excited for Lincoln in Private, which we already know is flying off the shelves. And we have copies at tatteredcover.com and in our stores, which you can purchase with us today. And so Mr. White is going to take it away here in just a moment, but I want to remind everyone that we will be doing a Q&A session after his presentation here tonight. And there's a chat next to the screen you're watching us on, and that's where you can ask all of your Lincoln-related questions. And so for now, Mr. White, take it away.
Abraham Lincoln said, "I never want one of those ideas to escape me." It was the spring of 1863, and Abraham Lincoln faced a chorus of critics. It was beginning to be called Mr. Lincoln's War, as the war was not going well. Union and Confederate forces fought, but the Northern public was becoming increasingly restless. There was a peace process going on within the Democratic Party. They were called Copperheads, and they wanted to return, as they said, the Union as it was, the Union with slavery, as it was in 1861. In Albany, New York, they held a rally in protest of Lincoln, and they crafted 10 resolves. They sent them to Lincoln, asking him to reply. He was sitting in his office in the White House when a congressman from Iowa entered. He watched Lincoln writing, and he said to the president, "This is amazing that you can simply sit down and write a letter from scratch." But Lincoln demurred, and pointing his long, bony finger to an open drawer of his desk, he said, "No, it's all in there. I have a lot of disconnected thoughts." He told Congressman Wilson, "I never let one of those ideas escape me." But those ideas have escaped us. For what we're talking about tonight is Lincoln's notes to himself. He never dated them, never titled them, and never signed them. But we know that they're his because of his distinctive handwriting. Sometimes they're called fragments because, almost perhaps like you or me, he would be writing a note and perhaps being called away, and so the note ends in the middle of a word or actually in the middle of a sentence. So through the years, as I've been working on Lincoln, I wondered, what if we took all of those notes together? What would they tell us about the private Lincoln behind the public Lincoln? But how many notes are there? So I'm very pleased to be cooperating in this book with the new Lincoln Papers project in Springfield, Illinois. It's a digital project, and I asked the director of the project, "How many notes do you have?" He said, "There are 111 surviving notes. Springfield has 110. They had digitized them from many, many libraries across the country. There's one note, and I'm pleased it's in this book, in a private library in Dallas, Texas. We'll talk about that note this evening. So the reason I wrote this book is because I think it shows something of Lincoln that we don't usually see in the traditional biographies. For we really encounter what I would call the public Lincoln, the Lincoln of the Gettysburg Address, or the Lincoln of the Second Inaugural Address. In fact, Lincoln's law partner in Springfield, William Herndon, said that Lincoln was, quote, "the most shut-mouthed man he had ever met." It may surprise you, but Lincoln was a very, very private person. So I've already been asked in the last week, well, how did I choose among 111 notes to write on 12 notes in 10 chapters? And it was a difficult decision, but the decision was made on the basis, let's show everyone the varied nature of these notes, the different writing styles, the problems that Lincoln is confronting. And also, I wanted to share something we never get in the public Lincoln, Lincoln's feelings. For to refresh our memory, Lincoln was born in 1809 in Kentucky. He lived there and at age 9 moved to southern Indiana. But growing up in Kentucky and Indiana, his parents attended Baptist churches in a time of what was called the Second Great Awakening. And these churches were very emotional. Lincoln, from an early age, did not like the emotionalism of this kind of religion. In fact, he would actually stand outside the church afterwards on a stump and repeat the minister's sermon word for word until his father hit him on the backside and told him to go home. And so from that point on and for the rest of his life, Lincoln determined to become a very rational person, to use logic, to be thoughtful, not to give way to feeling. But in a few minutes, we'll talk about the feeling that he does express in one of these notes. So, Michaela, let's bring up the first fragment so that everyone can see it and we can watch and see what Lincoln is doing with this particular fragment. It's a fragment on slavery. Do we have that note coming up?
Yes, I am bringing it to our screen right now.
Okay.
Perfect.
Terrific. All right. This actually is the one note that Springfield does not have. It's in the home of actually the private library with a full-time curator of a person in Dallas, Texas. And I'm grateful to Harlan Crow for giving me permission to use this note. Lincoln served 4 terms in the Illinois legislature, a single term in Congress, 1847 to 49. He took a stand against the war with Mexico, challenging President James Polk to the fact that Lincoln said the Mexicans didn't start this war, the Americans did. And he challenged Polk. He said, "You sit in the seat where Washington sat. Please be honest with us." Well, Lincoln returned home, and many of his constituents said, "Thank you very much. We're not going to elect you again. You've been rather traitorous in criticizing the President of the United States." So he set out to become a full-time lawyer, which he did for 5 years until 1854, when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. This act provided a possibility that slavery could now be extended west into the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. Lincoln was aghast that you had the possibility of voting for slavery in these new territories. As he formulated how he would speak against slavery, he began writing notes to himself. I think this is one of the most interesting. You can read it, I think, because his handwriting is so legible, but let me read it also. If A can prove, however conclusively, that he may be right, and therefore enslave B, why not B may snatch the same argument and prove equally that he may enslave A? You say A is white and B is black. It is color then, the lighter, having the right to enslave the darker. Take care. By this rule, you are to be a slave to the first man you meet with a fairer skin than your own. Oh, you do not mean color exactly. You mean whites are intellectually the superior to blacks, and therefore have the right to enslave them. Take care again. By this rule, you are to be slave to the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. But say you, it is a question of interest. And if you can make it your interest, you have the right to enslave another. Very well. And if he can make it his interest, he has the right to enslave you. Mr. Crow tells me that in his great private library, this is his most favorite note. Isn't this amazing? Remember that Lincoln had but 1 year of formal education. Boys were only afforded education in January and February when it was too cold in Kentucky and Indiana to be working outside on farms with their fathers. But Lincoln, and here's a good example for us, became a lifelong learner. And so I find this fragment quite remarkable. Notice the logic that he is using. Notice the way he is turning each of the arguments upside down. It's almost like he is here a prosecuting attorney, prosecuting the case against slavery. I love this note. But I suggested earlier that Lincoln also is willing to express his feelings in these notes in a way he never does in public. Let's continue his biography. In 1855, he ran for a United States Senate seat. In those days, the senators, until the early 20th century, were elected by state legislatures. Lincoln ran and led on the first 7 ballots. He was running against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, against the audacious idea that one could vote for slavery. But at the end of the 7th ballots, he recognized he was in danger of losing to another Republican who actually was in favor of slavery being advanced to the West. So he did something that his adherents did not want him to do. He withdrew from the race and allowed a Democrat who was also opposed to slavery to win. Now, after Lincoln lost this race, he was very magnanimous. He said, "It's all right, I'm okay," but not so in private. He wrote this note. Remember, I said at the outset, he never expected any of us to see this. His great rival in Illinois was the Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas, with whom he'd have 7 debates in 1858. And so he writes this note. With many of them, it's very hard to tell exactly the date, but listen to what he said. 22 years ago, Judge Douglas and I first became acquainted. Well, we can date this note because we know when they did meet. We were both young then, he a trifle younger than I. Even then we were both ambitious, I perhaps quite as much as he. With me, the race of ambition has become a failure, a flat failure. Can you imagine? Lincoln is here less than 4 years before he will be elected president of the United States, saying only to his ears, my life is a failure, a flat failure. Lincoln would never have said this in public. He would never have expressed this feeling. But here he does so in this remarkable note. Well, there's so many notes in here that are just quite remarkable. Lincoln talks about the birth of the Republican Party, which begins in 1854. He's concerned that many adherents to the party are unwilling to admit that there's a criticism of the party. It's a sectional party. He had been a member of the Whig Party previously, and it was a national party, but the Republican Party is basically an anti-slavery party. And so he writes 2 notes defending this party, that it's not really a sectional party, that it's also a national party. And then another aspect of Lincoln that I find quite remarkable, again, it's an example for us today. We're not very good at it. When Lincoln returned home from his single term in Congress, his law partner, William Herndon, said, well, let's begin to subscribe to some national anti-slavery magazines or newspapers. And so they did. But Lincoln said, I think we also ought to subscribe to some Southern newspapers. And Herndon said, well, why in the world would we do that? He said, let's subscribe to the leading newspaper in Richmond, Virginia, and another leading newspaper in Charleston, South Carolina. He said to Herndon, we need to have both sides at the table. Both sides at the table. Do you and I read both sides? Do we listen to both sides? One of, I think, the great characteristics of Lincoln is that he wanted to hear the other side. So in the midst of his debates with Stephen Douglas, he decides to buy a pro-slavery book, a book written by a Presbyterian minister called Slavery Ordained by God. He wants to read this book. He knows he won't agree with it, but he wants to hear what this writer is saying. So he reads this book and he writes a note about it to himself. He never mentions the book in a public speech, but I think it really is the grist for his thinking as how he's going to attack slavery. Let me read just a part of this note. Suppose it is true that the Negro is inferior to the white. This is what Frederick Ross, the minister from Huntsville, Alabama, is arguing, in the gifts of nature. Is it not the exact reverse justice that the white should, for that reason, take from the Negro any part of the little which has been given him? Give to him that is needy is the Christian rule of charity, but take from him that is needy is the rule of slavery. So Lincoln writes quite a long note critiquing this book, and you can hear his emotion rising as he writes the note. Listen to the end of it. But slavery is good for some people, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. I discovered that Lincoln often would speak the words out loud before he wrote them on the paper. Did you know that most people in the 19th century read out loud? I once was traveling and studying in England some years ago. We stopped in an inn. We're sitting in the main drawing room, and suddenly everybody was reading out loud. You and I read silently, but in doing so, we often, I think, miss what Lincoln called the 2 dimensions of reading, not simply the dimension of the eye, but the dimension of the ear. So Lincoln continues, as a good thing, slavery is strikingly peculiar in this, that it is the only good thing which no man ever seeks the good of for himself. Nonsense! Wolves devouring lambs, not because it is good for their own greedy maws, but because it is good for the lambs. Triple exclamation point. Lincoln is really into this. But remember, this is a note written for his eyes only. He's trying to figure out how he is going to attack the demon of slavery. Let's turn to one more note, and McKaylee, I'll ask you if you could put that note up on the screen. This is the first note that I ever found a long time ago. I was teaching in the history department at UCLA. The Huntington Library in San Marino, California, was offering an exhibit on Lincoln, and I didn't know anything about Lincoln. That had not been the focus of my graduate study. But I thought, gee, this would be an interesting experience to take the students from UCLA across Los Angeles freeways to the exhibit at the Huntington Library. When I got there, I wanted someone to give the students a lecture. It wouldn't be me, so I found someone to give the lecture. As class resumed, we were reading Lincoln's speeches and writings, letters. I found myself entranced by his second inaugural address. He'd been elected for a second term. His first inaugural address, about 25 to 30 minutes. His second inaugural address was only six and a half minutes. A remarkable address. It surprised his audience. His audience, I read the letters and diaries of the people who were there that day. Probably every person had lost a father, husband, son, brother, and they were deeply angry. They were angry at the South, 720,000 dead, and they wanted Lincoln to express their anger. That's what we do. We express our anger against the so-called enemy. But Lincoln surprised them that day. He wrote a second inaugural address that was about forgiveness, about reconciliation. Well, where did this come from? Well, 2.5 years before that address, unknown to anybody in that audience, the North had suffered another disastrous defeat, the second defeat at Bull Run or Manassas. Lincoln convened an emergency cabinet meeting. Fortunately for us, 3 members of his cabinet kept diaries. One of them, his Secretary of Attorney General, actually from Missouri, wrote in his diary, Lincoln said he was struck by the bitterest of anguish. He felt almost ready to hang himself. We think that afternoon, it's hard to exactly date it, Lincoln sat and wrote this address. I think you can read it because of Lincoln's handwriting, but let me read it also. The will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. People had been coming to Lincoln to say, God is on our side. He knew they were coming to Jefferson Davis to say, God is on our side. Both may be, and one must be wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. Do you hear the logical Lincoln writing this? In the present Civil War, this is the most remarkable sentence of all. In the present Civil War, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party. And yet the human instrumentalities, working just as they do, are of the best adaptation to effect his purpose. I'm almost ready to say this is probably true, that God wills this contest and wills that it shall not end yet. By his mere quiet power, remember Lincoln rebelled against the noisy God he heard as a boy. By his mere quiet power on the minds of the now contestants, he could have either saved or destroyed the Union without a human contest. And having begun, he could give the final victory to either side any day. Yet the contest proceeds. Do you understand why Lincoln never would have said this in public? God could give the final victory to either side any day. Well, my goodness, you are the commander-in-chief, President Lincoln. You're supposed to be winning this battle. How dare you suggest that the victory might go to either side? If you think about it, and I write about this in my book, this is really the foundation of the second inaugural address. 2.5 years later, in 701 words, Lincoln will mention God 14 times, quote the Bible 4 times, and invoke prayer 3 times. But the structure of the second inaugural really builds upon the structure of the meditation on the divine will. Well, drawing my presentation to a close, in the epilogue, I suggest I love talking with high school students. I've spoken with high school students from Massachusetts to Hawaii, mostly 11th graders who are studying United States history. Every generation needs to come in contact with Lincoln. When I talk to them about these notes or fragments, I will often end by asking these high school students, how long do you think it took Lincoln to write these fragments? Their answers would be 3 minutes, 4 minutes, and I pause, and with a sort of a wry smile, perhaps I say, how about 30 minutes or an hour and a half? At one private school in Pasadena, California, when I said that, the faculty standing in the back were applauding. We can't do this quickly. We have to get away from the distractions of our screens. If we're going to take the time, as Lincoln did, to think deeply about the issues of our day, to invoke the kind of intellectual curiosity that underlies everything that he is saying here. So Lincoln in Private is written so that we can see the private Lincoln behind the public Lincoln. Oh, he's a 19th century figure. He can't help us with climate change. He can't advise modern presidents on what to do in Afghanistan. But somehow I think his language, his values, his truthfulness, his empathy, his magnanimity still speaks to us today. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you. I'm so glad we got the visuals of the writing so that one, we could see his gorgeous handwriting, because nobody writes like that anymore, especially not me and my left-handed folk. But also so that we could see it in his own words. It brings a certain level of evidence, and genuinity is not a word, but I was thinking genuineness is what I was going for here. But I want to move on to audience Q&A, which we have plenty of time for here. So if you have any questions for Ron in the chat, you can ask them in the chat. But one of the ones that I wanted to ask you, and you mentioned it in the beginning, that originally, like during college, you were not studying Lincoln. So why Lincoln? What about this man who's been studied and recorded by so many because of his revolutionary actions? But what about Lincoln for you that makes you want to study him and write him?
Well, yes, my graduate study at Princeton had nothing to do with Lincoln. It was the progressive era, early 20th century. I now recall that as a teenager, I actually did buy Carl Sandburg's biographies of Lincoln way back then. They weren't done very well as paperbacks. I had to keep them tied together with string to be able to read them. But then I heard that the Huntington Library was putting on this exhibit on Lincoln, and I had the choice every year at UCLA to offer a seminar of my choice. So I thought, well, this is a great way to get students involved, take them to this exhibit. We all got excited about it, so I offered a seminar on Lincoln. I didn't know anything, but we all started reading Lincoln's letters, his speeches, and we all got so excited I offered it the next year. And the Huntington exhibit got extended, and so we went another year. And then I thought, this second inaugural address, I'd like to maybe order a book on that and make that part of my class the next year. There were no books. There were 5 books on the Gettysburg Address. So I said rather boldly, I'll write the book. And that's how it all began. I felt very much like a Johnny come lately, because there's people who spend their whole life, their whole professional life, writing on this. I didn't start this until somewhat later in my life. But then, as Lincoln does, I'm sure for people who are listening and watching us this evening, he just captures you because he's such a remarkable person.
No, and I think that's what's very interesting about this particular book is, you get these musings that he wrote to himself and things that I can't recall being taught in school. Honestly, you're taught the Gettysburg Address and how he helped end slavery in the Civil War, and so I'm very curious about the curation. You said there were over 100 of these and that you had to pick a few. Are there any that you wish you had put in here, or any that you might go back and revisit?
Well, an interesting part of this, McKaylee, is that you know this as a person dealing with books every day and audiobooks. I'd wanted to do the audiobook for my biography of Lincoln and my biography of American Ulysses. Oh no, we have professionals who do this. I laughingly say they're usually British actors. But I asked one more time. I said, could I possibly narrate this book? And they said, well, we're going to give you a tryout. We'll listen to you on YouTube. And they said, yes, you can do it. So I narrate this book. The way you do it is you have your earphones on, and believe it or not, I had a British actor who lives in the United States now, who was my director. But in doing so, the audiobook director said, well, why not take 5 more fragments or notes from the appendix and we can talk about those. So in the audiobook, we do take 5 more and read those. It was a tough
Well, that,
decision because
but
there's so
that's
many great ones.
yeah, no,
But
and
I didn't want to write a 700-page book. I
no,
wanted
I do not blame you. But and I want to just quickly plug that you can get audiobooks at libro.fm, which and Lincoln in Private is also on there too. And you can get those and support your local independent bookstore. So if you want those 5 extra fragments read by Ronald White himself, you can get that at libro.fm. I just wanted to plug that in there because audiobooks are such a wonderful way of reading. And especially when you talk about reading out loud too. I find that so interesting that people read aloud
Well, what was
during
really
this time.
fascinating is that originally they said, well, why don't we have 2 readers? We'll have you do the narration and we'll have somebody else, a British actor, read Lincoln. And I said, well, I don't want to be presumptuous, but I've been living with Lincoln for about 25 years. I think I know how Lincoln might have said these words. Would it be possible that I can also be Lincoln? Oh, yes, you can do the whole thing. That was fun.
Oh, well, and maybe that's why you wanted it to be shorter too, so you would have to
Right,
record a shorter audiobook.
right.
Uh, but I want to. There's a great question here about editing and about how do you take a man whose life is so comprehensive and boil it down, and pick and choose. And obviously there's a lot of people who don't know in the book industry, you think that it's just a writer at their typewriter all by them lonesome self, when that's not the case. There's editors and graphic designers and marketing publicists that come into play for books. So what does that editing process look like for you when trying to scale it from these fragments and all that you know after a quarter of a century and into this book?
Well, when I wrote my biography, American Ulysses, I somehow mistakenly thought 1 page on the computer was 1 page in print. And when I turned in the book, my editor, David Ebersoff, was very upset with me. He said, Ron, this book is 150 pages too long. You have to cut 150 pages. Wow, what a process. But my process, in answer to your question, is I'm very interested in what I call the formation of these leaders. I write for what I call from the inside out, not simply what a person did, but what a person thinks and feels. I'm also very interested in the formation of the young person in a book. I think modern biographies often skip over the young person to get to the mature adult who has become president, CEO, whatever the person has become, military leader. But if you think about this, who you and I are from ages 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, this is how we become the mature adult.
Those are some formative years right
Those are the
there.
formative years. So I've been very interested in how was Lincoln formed? What formed him to become the person that he is?
I'm curious also about I have a couple questions, but about the subtitle of what his personal reflections tell us about our greatest president. And obviously, you've written so many books about this, but if a student asks you, one of your 11th graders, why is Lincoln the greatest president? What do you say to them?
That's a good question. And interestingly, right now I have in my hands literally the new C-SPAN Presidential Historian Survey. At the end of a presidency, the end of the presidency of Donald Trump, there'll be a new survey. I have to turn it in by June 1st, in which we will rank all 45 presidents. Lincoln has always finished first in the surveys done in the 21st century. There have been 3 so far. Why is he first? Well, you can argue, is it the person who makes the times or the times who make the presidents? The top 3 are Lincoln, George Washington, and FDR. Lincoln, the Civil War; George Washington, the Revolutionary War; FDR, the Depression and World War II. So other presidents may have great qualities, but were not presiding in such difficult times. But I think Lincoln is also what I would call our most eloquent president. As Winston Churchill led his nation through World War II as much by his words, Lincoln led this nation through the Civil War by his words. So no disrespect to FDR or George Washington, but I'll answer it one other way. I was invited in 2009 by the State Department to speak in Germany. And the first stop was in Hamburg. Germans had been staying away from United States embassies because of their disagreement with the United States over the war in Iraq. And with the new president, Barack Obama, they thought this was an opportunity to invite them back. They contacted me and said, we want to do soft diplomacy. I said, what's soft diplomacy? They said, Abraham Lincoln. So my audience was 12th and 13th grade teachers, German teachers, teaching history and English. And after I spoke and they asked some questions, I said, may I ask you a question? I said, why are you so interested in Abraham Lincoln? And one woman spoke up and said, well, we know American history, and my goodness, do they? She said, we know the story of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. But for us, Abraham Lincoln, better than anyone else, incarnates what is America. That you can begin with nothing. You can begin in poverty. You can have very little formal education, and you can rise. Now, in our country, she said, we are used to a history of aristocrats, of well-born people. America for us is different and distinctive from our history. And no one is better representative of that than Abraham Lincoln. That answer by that German teacher has stuck with me through all these years.
What a formative answer. Wow. Like what impact
Yeah,
that gave you. That's
yeah,
amazing.
yeah.
Which is so interesting to me and brings me to my next question, actually, because one of the most fascinating chapters I found was chapter 4, the defeated Lincoln, and
Yes.
this idea of this figure that throughout history we put on a pedestal and thought of this great man and all that he's done, and the defeated Lincoln really humanizes him. I'd love it if you could just expound on that chapter a little bit and why you titled it The Defeated Lincoln as that side of him.
Well, you're right. And I have to stop myself. It's pretty easy to put, as you suggest, Lincoln on a pedestal. But Lincoln was on a journey like all of us. As a young man, his satire could hurt, his humor could cut. One day he was in Springfield and he heard of a man who was attacking the then Whig Party. He rushed over to confront this man. When he walked into the auditorium, he saw that this man had some kind of disability. He was kind of shaking as he spoke. And Lincoln got up and mimicked the disability of this man. And the man broke down in tears and rushed out of the room. This was the young Lincoln. And Lincoln, over time, not quick time, realized what he had done. He found the man and apologized to him. But Lincoln, the young man, could hurt with his satire, with his speaking. It's the Lincoln of the presidency who's magnanimous to the South. We're all on a journey. Sometimes when we're young, not picking on the young, we can be pretty straightforward with our speech. Lincoln mellows with age and becomes a much more mature and magnanimous person.
Absolutely, as a lot of us hope to do.
Right.
As we get there. But and so I have two more questions before we end this evening here. And one of which is, where does your research start when you're working on a project like this? with all of this material? Obviously when you were trying your first book, like you didn't have the same kind of research. There were only 5 books written on it. But where do you start nowadays? What does your research process look like?
Well, believe it or not, I start writing the first day. Once upon a time, I was the dean of an institution, and I had a young faculty member who was going to do a sabbatical in Cambridge, England. And so I said to him, now, what are you going to do in these next 6 months? He said, I'm going to spend the entire 6 months doing research. I said, let me make a suggestion. You start writing the first day. Well, how can I do that? I said, because the writing will direct your research. So don't waste your time simply doing research, putting off writing. So obviously I have to find the sources, but I try to combine the writing and the research. So every morning I try to write. And then in the afternoon, I do the reading, and often in the evening, I will print out what I've written that morning. I don't edit on the computer, and I will edit it. And then I don't have writer's block because the very next morning, I go back and type in my edits into the computer and then try to move forward. It might be a page, page and a half, 2 pages. That's my process.
No, forward is forward. And
Yeah.
that's really good because I like that idea that some people use research to stall the writing process, but you put the book first, you put the story first, which it shows. You know what I mean? Like these
So believe it or not, I'm actually edit each chapter about 50 or 60 times.
oh, I believe it.
I
Hands
just,
down.
and I say to young people in schools, there's no such thing as good writing.
No.
There's only good rewriting. And Lincoln I discovered, was a rewriter. In my earlier book, The Eloquent President, I include many of the drafts that Lincoln has for his great speeches. He never wrote something out and just gave it like that. We think he's a genius, but part of his genius is hard work. So he edited and revised and edited and revised to come up with what were magical speeches.
Absolutely. It's a muscle. And
Yeah.
it's beautiful to see that humanness. And I
Yes.
know that I'm not the only one who's grateful for you kind of peeling back the curtain with this book and Lincoln. I want to ask this last question, which we love to ask here at Tattered Cover. So answer it, interpret it as you will. But what did this book, Lincoln in Private, teach you?
What did the book teach me? I do say something about this in the epilogue. It has taught me in many ways to write my own notes, to think carefully and deeply, to keep a pad by my bedside table, and sometimes to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and write something down that is an insight that, as Lincoln said, I don't want any of these thoughts to escape me. And sometimes you and I have things. I've done some events with David Brooks, and he's remarkable. He has this little thing that he keeps in his vest pocket or his shirt pocket. It's nothing fancy, and he's always taking it out and writing it down and writing it down and writing it down because he doesn't want those ideas to escape him. And think of all of us. We have wonderful ideas, but they escape us. And I'll write that down when I get home and when I finish driving or when I finish, and then they're gone. We need to write them down when we have them so that they stay with us. Yeah.
And so that 200 years later, maybe somebody will write a book about them. No, I think that's a wonderful note to end on because it says something, and it goes with your ending of your presentation about getting away from the screens. There's something about physically writing it down and
Yes.
physically putting a pen to paper
Yes.
to get your thoughts out, rather than even just typing it. So I think that's wonderful because that's the example that we're given here by arguably the greatest president. Ron, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for this book. I know that I'm not the only one out there who enjoyed it and who will continue to enjoy it. I want to give you the chance to remind people who you are, where they can find you online, or anything else that you want to say tonight before we close out.
Well, I do have a website, Ronald C. White, www.ronaldcwhite.com. I have a wonderful website manager. And so there you can see the coming events and you can see information about the various books. You can see some of the videos of past appearances and presentations. Thank you for asking me.
No, absolutely. Ronald, it was a pleasure. I really want to encourage everybody to get their copy of Lincoln in Private by Ronald C. White, which you can get online at tatteredcover.com or at any one of our 3 currently open stores. It's been a pleasure. And if you'll stick around, Ronald, I just close this out here. I'm McKaylee with Tattered Cover Bookstore, and this has been Lincoln in Private with Ronald C. White. We hope that you join us for other virtual events. For some of you out there, it's close to dinner time. You might want to consider ordering from a local mom and pop restaurant, shopping local, supporting local businesses. We would not be here without you. So thank you so much. Stay safe, everybody, and happy reading. Good night, all.